Okay, we are live. This is October the 14th, 2025. Happy birthday, George Floyd and Charlie Kirk. So I had a debate this evening with John Levon, more of a discussion about the topic of media manipulation through what has been termed predictive programming, which I think is a misnomer because what we're describing actually includes real-time media and entertainment alignments. So I coined the phrase concurrent programming. And when I say media events, like news events that correlate specifically to something contemporaneous in the entertainment, I'm referring to staged events, psyops, not regular events that aren't really notable or given national attention or any kind of hype. So to really begin this, there was a conversation X today that started off when Synchromorpheus made a post showing some coincidences, some connections between the 1998 movie Snake Eyes, the 2025 movie Head of State, and the Charlie Kirk assassination. Namely being that Charlie Kirkland is killed in Snake Eyes. The character next to him is this blonde woman who's central to the conspiracy. Well, that actress is in a 2025 movie called Heads of State, and her name in that movie is Vice President Kirk, Elizabeth Kirk. But in the wake of the Charlie Kirk memorial, Erica Kirk was floated around as a possible VP for J.D. Vance. So when I saw Vice President Kirk, I thought, well, that's an interesting coincidence. The fact that it's the same actress who was in that role where Charlie Kirkland died is an interesting coincidence. And then you add in the fact that she is shot in the neck and dies similar to Charlie Kirk and Charlie Kirkland. And it gets even deeper if you throw in the release of Hulu's The Tempest on September 10th, where a Charlie Kirk-like character, the leader of the Youth Republicans, in a church, and he gets shot in the neck. Well, the opening scene is a dream sequence where his widow dreams of getting shot in the neck. So you even have the visuals of the corresponding character in The Tempest to Erica Kirk getting the same exact treatment. So these repeated themes, the imagery, and the timing of the releases, the actors involved, the actresses involved, these are the kinds of things that we're looking at here. The significance of Snake Eye has been widely reported on, but the fact that it connects to Heads of State with the actors and the name is just further indication of this closed system of certain movies are being used as propaganda conduits for simulated events, for people on the world stage who will exist at some future point, or they're characterizing existing people in a certain light. So, for example, this Tempest on Hulu features a character who is the leader of the Youth Republicans, and his widow takes over his organization. And his widow is accused of perhaps behind the assassination, and her crying on TV is challenged as being inauthentic. Like, I could be talking about Erica Kirk or her corresponding character, and it wouldn't be possible to tell the difference because their stories are tracking. But to get into this, Synchromorpheus, compared these different scenes. And what he said here is, I have a theory that the over-the-top, undeniable predictive programming, so he's talking about undeniable predictive programming, and that's what caught John Levon's attention. How can it be undeniable when you still haven't identified a clear suspect or a clear motive? And then you have a simulation person coming in saying, by human design or not, are you open to it being a different cause? So this is where the conversation starts. because people say, well, John LeBon says, well, where's your culprits? And this other person says, are you open to it being a different cause? Implying the Matrix simulation did it. And I chime in with, there is a third option, which is our pattern recognition monkey brains are seeing connections that aren't really there. But that's a lazy explanation that one could only arrive at in complete ignorance of the preponderance of evidence indicating mass entertainment is platforming PSYOP reinforcement content. And this is the best explanation posited yet. And this Charlie Kirk thing only underscores that our methodology has been on point and our pattern recognition is attached to an actual pattern. So to address what John LeBon stated here, as far as how can it be undeniable when you haven't identified a clear suspect or a clear motive, I have both. The motive is history bending, news bending, total global mind control through worldview warfare. Mission accomplished. As far as the suspects are readily identifiable as well, which we will get to. But let me go through a number of his tweets and my responses, and we'll go from there. So when I started off evaluation of the Charlie Kirk event, my starting point wasn't it's fake. My starting point is actually looks real, looks ghastly, could be real, but in context and over a few days gathering more information, I looked at it with a different perspective. So in context, we're looking at an event that follows the Butler, Pennsylvania event, which we've already hyperanalyzed, and it follows along with many of the same hoax indicators. And there are plenty of hoax indicators here. But in particular, what I had said was, if it's fake, there will be contemporaneous programming in the entertainment and predictive stuff. But if it's fake, that is one of the hallmarks of fakery, in addition to many other things. So John LeBon had a quote. He said, "We can predict them. Do you mean that you can predict when you go and see a new Hollywood film that you will find coincidences between that film and major news stories?" My response is, I have on many occasions. And I stated, if this event is fake, we will see the relevant concurrently released content in popular entertainment. I was correct with Charlie Kirk, having stated this before I even heard of The Tempest and Snake Eyes or Heads of State. And other examples like podcast Thought Crimes, episode 33, Charlie Kirk, advocate for public and televised executions, after which Tyler tells him the last publicly broadcast execution was in France by guillotine on September 10th, 1977. Tyler, September 10th, execution, blood. This would also include the Emerson Drive video, Erica Kirk's own comment on September 10th, 2012, to Tyler, a different Tyler, and this was 13 years ago, to the day of September 10th, she said, they had a great shoot. They had a blast. It was a great shoot, Tyler, in a video where she zip lines past the numbers 9 and 10, like September 10th. So then I also included a number of links to my blog about Charlie Kirk and the Tempest, about how the widow's story follows Erica Kirk's story, the Erica Kirk predictive programming in the video, these other eerie coincidences, her connection with the character in Snake Eyes and Heads of State. And I even threw in a blog post about how Charlie Kirk's final YouTube short was a video entitled Enough is Enough. And if you know what that means. So he follows this up with, has there been any major news events which you stated, quote, if the event is fake, we'll see relevant concurrently released content and predictive programming, and there were none or no such connections. So my response to that is there are certain criteria. We're talking about national news stories with immediately implementable political agendas, often questionable characters, people often labeled as crisis actors, stories which track along with the bifurcated political horseshoe stances on the opposing sides where they take predictable positions. This is a pattern. And my opinion is based upon empirical research. So there are three ways you can look at this. One, it's government propaganda inserted like product placement for future fake events. Or two, it's just a coincidence and we're cherry picking. And that's the mainstream stance. But the accumulated research that the IPS think tank has engaged in consistently for the last 5 years or more has discerned the nature of what we're actually seeing here. So is it coincidence? Is it a meaningful coincidence? Or is it propaganda, as in man deceiving or manipulating man? And so I'm suggesting here that the government uses every single propaganda vector, including individual influencers, to advance agendas that are implemented in the wake of said event. And this is often described as problem, reaction, solution. They create a problem, get the reaction, advance a solution that they planned in advance once they had the public clamoring for it. Well, that's what psychological operations do. They advance agendas. So if an event that we're looking at as questionable advances an agenda, well, that's a hoax indicator. But to go on here, you could call them influence operations or public relations stunts. The idea that it comes from a higher source like a simulation has long since been debunked. I argue that the simulation hypothesis is in fact a misinformation line to hide the concerted nature of propaganda promulgation through platforms that people mistakenly imagine to be separate and independent. So here we have the starting point for our back and forth, which was very productive, I think, as you'll agree. So I'm going to go through a list of his observations or questions about my line of thinking here. So he says, you mentioned divine fallacy and have previously mentioned simulation theory. But what you haven't done is explained why the coincidences which occur in your real life are separate from the ones which occur in the mainstream media. Are your real life coincidences simulation theory or divine? So that's an interesting question here. And to answer it, I first said, I'm describing how our history is being manipulated, augmented, and infused with simulated historic events. We tend to call these psyops. 9/11 is a great example. How many instances do we have of psychic preparation or psychological preparation for an event in the form of predictive programming content? Well, with 9/11 in particular, there's decades of it. And this goes back to 2001 Space Odyssey, even just to go with Kubrick, The Shining, Full Metal Jacket. But there are so many different examples, books, Tom Clancy books, comic books, cartoons. It's just insane when you get into how much, and it actually intensified near 9/11. And even as we approached 9/11, many movies that were released in the wake of 9/11 had to alter, like, for example, Collateral Damage. They had to take out scenes because it was so close to what just happened. So there was decades of psychological preparation for 9/11. We can also presume here safely that the earliest instance of predictive programming relating to the event indicates how long in advance it was planned. So the further back it was planned, like, for example, the Charlie Kirk thing, I would say since Snake Eyes 1998, you could reasonably presume at least 27 years before the event was going to happen. And the person who was going to play the role was likely chosen from a pool of candidates at a later time. Because obviously Kirk would have been a toddler when this script was already created. So this is a role that he played, is my contention. They don't kill people in psyops. That was a magic show, not a snuff film. So from the point that they have the PSYOP script, this simulated historic event is going to happen in 15 years. Well, that's a long time. And from that point, any number of directors, writers, musicians, or artists could be tapped on the shoulder to insert propaganda messaging, and they wouldn't have to know the purpose. So to get to his question, it doesn't have anything to do with synchronicity, which is a highly subjective take on human experience, but it does have to do with synchronized media and entertainment. So entertainment is synchronized with simulated news events. I think synchronicity has been thrown into the mix here solely for the point of confusing us, to the point where those who notice glitches in the news think that reality itself is glitching, rather than recognizing that the news is simulated. So the people who notice this stuff, traditionally, going back since I've been looking at this, their default explanation was, hey, it looks kind of like a simulation on TV. The world must be a simulation. The universe is a simulation. And I'm saying no. The fact that they're simulating events in the news does not mean that reality is a simulation. It's misinformation, cognitive sabotage. So I was thinking back to the derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, and how even the news media had to notice it because it was so close, as they had to notice snake eyes. But they conspicuously didn't notice Hulu's The Tempest, which had way more of this type of mirroring than the older movie Snake Eyes. Well, the news media noticed that this East Palestine, Ohio train derailment mirrored the Netflix white noise. But not only that, the extras in white noise who lived in that area had to be evacuated from the quote real train wreck. So the media describes these as coincidences, and they just dismiss them. InfoWars says it's dark occultists telling us the bad things they're going to do. So I describe these as higher and lower power explanations. Higher power says it's the Matrix, it's the sim, it's beyond human comprehension. Makes me think of Arthur C. Clarke. Any sufficiently developed technology is indistinguishable from magic. Doesn't mean it is magic. Lower powers say dark wizards are doing it because they're going to reveal their methods in advance. Now, those explanations sufficed for a long time for some people, for a lot of people, actually. It's like the dominant explanation in Trutherville. But my argument is that the mainstream version, it's just a coincidence. And the alternative version, it's more than coincidence. It's either nefarious or it's supernatural. Both of those are wrong because they exist in a closed informational system where the starting point is the event is essentially real. And that's the point where we have to diverge here, because the predictive content only ever foreshadows fake events. And what's more here is that my contention is that the people who are noticing patterns are being misled on purpose, so that instead of studying these patterns, they will dismiss them and say it couldn't be intentional. It's random. Or if there is an intelligent source for it, it's not man. And that's where the simulation people come in. And it makes me think of pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. But what's more, and this is why you have to evaluate these patterns and how pervasive this phenomenon is, because there is a long-term cumulative effect of simulated news events on our shared history. And this is observable. You realize that most people believe the fake news, or like the dominant majority, even among the alternative media, buy the essential story, even if they have different opinions about it. So the role of predictive and concurrent programming in this is that it creates this saturation of the media ecosystem with concerned messaging. And this can all be observed, and it has political utility. It influences political opinions. All of this flies in the face of the fact it flies in the face of the claim that this is caused by something higher than man, because something higher than man isn't going to advance a democratic that agenda with a psyop or a influence operation that scores political points for one side. Or in other words, these are very mundane things, but it's been described as supernatural or as mind-blowing, and it's really not. The big reveal here is that entertainment happens to be a wing of government globally. So I contend that these are not anomalies, but standard operating procedure, not a bug, it's a feature. And this is a thing, it goes back as far as JFK, the JFK assassination. Look at the director of the Manchurian Candidate, John Frankenheimer, who popularized the idea of the mind-controlled assassin. He actually drove RFK to the Ambassador Hotel, where he was killed by a mind-controlled assassin. My focus here has been on the last 60 years or so of fake events and how entertainment in books, video games, comics, and podcasts, how it's all part of the same propaganda machine. Based on Snake Eyes, my conclusion with the Charlie Kirk event is that the simulated event was planned 27 plus years ago, while that individual that we knew as Charlie Kirk was still a toddler, so it's likely he got the gig later in life out of a pool of potential candidates to play Charlie. And Charlie was always going to be taken out in a spectacular way on September 10th, 2025. I mean, other examples. There's predictive programming for Donald Trump in his present form in many movies. I can list a wide array of movies preparing us for Trump, but goes back as far as 1958 with Trackdown, which even predicted his arrest that happened 8 years after the media noticed the, quote, eerie coincidences in that show. I'd also throw Elon Musk into this as a construct, an amalgamation of many different characters. But notably, as one of the first colonizers of Mars, the Elon, in the book by Werner von Braun, Mars, A Technical Tale. This systemic fakery is the only real conspiracy. As far as I'm concerned, it's the only real conspiracy, and it's a successful one, and it's ongoing. All the other conspiracy theories exist in the MSM fictional universe. So to continue here, there are certain criteria, and we're not saying everything is fake. So John LeBon had said, we see bizarre coincidences between pop culture and major news stories, like Charlie Kirkland shot in the neck in Snake Eyes. We also see bizarre coincidences in our own lives. How do we know that the cause is entirely separate? Why are these distinct? And my answer to that is it's apples and oranges, because the predictive and concurrent programming only ever precedes fake events. So it's a form of propaganda. It utilizes the techniques of product placement, target marketing. And what's more, these staged events are typically, if not always, but we don't always find out, but they're typically attended by drills. Why would they have drills scheduled alongside psychological operations if they weren't somehow part of the same complex, the same PSYOP entertainment complex? In other words, the drills, the event, and the entertainment elements are all part of the same overall operation. And this is highly significant simply because the mass casualty simulation drills and the like would be the work of DHS, Department of Homeland Security, working with media, politicians, hospitals, and police. So you're looking at a obviously entirely explainable, humanly explainable, no need to reach for something divine type of event, is in a simulated event that has some political utility. And if these were all coincidences with no human intentionality, they wouldn't have drills alongside of them. So we don't look at the entertainment stuff in isolation. We look at the entire surrounding media ecosystem. And beyond that, movies have directors. So we don't need to be mystified about the source of it. or conflate the source of predictive programming with the source of synchronistic experiences. Because the more we look at the directors involved in this type of content, the more the same names pop up again and again. For example, Christopher and Jonathan Nolan. I'd call them metascriptors. They're not channeling a higher power. They're not blindly responding to unseen forces, causing them to unintentionally, yet with great specificity, foreshadow future simulated events packaged as real and sold to the public, events that have political utility. No, that's not what is actually happening here. We're looking at artists, musicians, directors, etc., who are working in part as propagandists. They're sellouts. So personal synchronicity is subjective. Synchronized content within entertainment and news and agendas, government agendas, this is objective. Objective, documentable events, fact-based analysis. So the synchronization between these things looks like synchronicity, but it's not. It's apples and oranges. The predictive and specifically concurrent programming, which is much stronger, makes a stronger case for the Charlie Kirk thing, and it's in the movies, it's in several podcasts, music videos. It obliterates any explanation for this thing other than it was an engineered historic event. It was planned that long in advance. And I'm not saying they planned to kill a guy named Charlie Kirk when he grew up. No, I'm saying that this historic event was going to be grafted onto our shared timeline. And now it is. You think the history books are going to include the possibility that he was an actor on the world stage? No, the history books are going to go with Tyler Robinson shot him. So this was a historic event planned long ago, and the predictive content indicates this. So these coincidences that we're seeing here have been highlighted by mass media because they're so unignorable. And they can't be dismissed as mere coincidence. And they can't be labeled as special synchronistic coincidences that man cannot be blamed for. Like, in other words, if this stuff is just random, then we're absolving the manipulators of responsibility for their role in this. And what we're seeing here is that mass entertainment offers content support for incoming, upcoming psyops. The media and entertainment and government are all one. Welcome to Bread and Circuses 2025. Total global mind control has been achieved by man against man. To suggest man isn't doing it gives a pass to the manipulators who work behind the scenes, fabricating our consensus worldview. I mean, imagine that our consensus worldview is manipulated, bent, fabricated, or manipulated in mass. Think of 2020, for example. And imagine not wanting to find out who the culprits were in engineering, manufacturing, public complicity for terrible agendas. Terrible things, bad agendas get advanced because of these psyops. And some people are arguing that maybe this is all just happening due to something other than human influence. And like, no, I don't think we should give it a pass. Now, on that note, John LeBon had said, entertainment is synchronized with simulated news events, quote. If this is true, and you accurately predicted the Trump shooting event as you claim, then how are you not a suspect in this alleged synchronization? Were you forewarned? I doubt it. My response? Good question. I'm not a platformed mainstream influencer reaching mass audiences targeted with the programming. One of my criteria for evaluating content that could be described as relevant is asking, quote, does it reach mass audiences who will experience the corresponding psyop, quote. So that's one of the first things I ask. Like I watched the #1 on Amazon, the #1 on Netflix, the #1 movie at the time, because that's the overlap, the mass entertainment and the mass media. I've not been given a propagandist role to serve the masses with messaging to reinforce incoming simulated events. I'm not part of the history making process. The media presents a perspective which omits and excludes those who are not part of this history making process. Next, he said, you mentioned divine fallacy, and you have previously mentioned simulation theory. What you haven't done is explained why the coincidences which occur in your real life are separate from the ones that occur in MSM. Now, yeah, I said this is apples and oranges, but I also want to point out here that the very concept of synchronicity has been misplaced. And it's very confusing to those who've accepted the premise that these are organic events. So the pattern here is that these events, these major fake events that are predicted, etc., that the pattern here is that structural, that these are not anomalies. And having studied this year after year, empirical research just really has piled up here that we're looking at some part of the media itself, like this hidden architecture that we're not supposed to know about. But I'm not here to say that I'm prophesying, but we are making informed guesses or informed, not, again, we're not doing prophecy or predictions, but you can somewhat, there is some predictability if the model itself is valid. And so but more importantly, though, I'll get to that, but I'm using this to discredit events that are passed off as real, because a major hoax indicator would be entertainment content that reinforces that so a psyop is propaganda. And if that piece of propaganda has corresponding propaganda in entertainment, it's logical to conclude that these things are related. So I'm doing this with regularity. When I watched The Tempest, I pointed out that after the Charlie Kirk corresponding character gets shot in the neck, his widow takes over his organization. She's instructed by her advisor to go on stage and cry to win their sympathy. They called it her triple axel moment, where she won over the crowd. Well, this happened with Erica Kirk. Additionally, and again, this is a series that came out on September 10th, but subsequent episodes have had corresponding developments in the Kirk saga. Even the suggestion that her grief was inauthentic was mirrored in these subsequent episodes. I have screen caps of it here where the widow of the assassinated leader of the Youth Republicans said to the wife, or rather the mistress said to the widow, hey, since that day, your grief has been displayed across the nation. There's no such thing as graceful grief. Because people had noted too that Erica Kirk's grief was graceful. And she said, real grief is ugly. So in this episode, the insinuation is that her grief was fake and that she might have been part of the plot, which wraps up in Snake Eyes. I mean, because Snake Eyes had that, and it wraps up with the story around Erica Kirk with the Emerson Drive country music video, where that has been a point of discussion here, that she's actually part of it, that it was a conspiracy against Charlie. I mean, it's pretty convoluted when you go down these rabbit trails, but they all have a corollary in this movie series. So I'm not psychic, but I told my listeners that this was in the script. And the precision and the directness with which these events are mirrored takes it out of the realm of being cherry-picked or Texas sharpshooter fallacy. I mean, this is not even subtle product placement for this particular psyop. This is propaganda messaging in mainstream popular entertainment, So what I said to him in the tweet here, you can stay with the mainstream perspective on this stuff and write it off as mere coincidence, pattern recognition run amok, but you still have to provide a way to explain away the predictive and concurrent programming other than relying on a divine fallacy or other than saying something other than man. In fact, logically speaking, Occam's razor, the simplest explanation with the fewest number of logical leaps, ought to be applied, the law of parsimony. In this case, it 100% applies. What's more likely, that God or simulation is giving us direct evidence in the movies and I'm documenting it daily, or that man is manipulating man and I'm documenting it daily? One of my stronger points for this argument that man is doing it is the concurrent drills, which were there on 9/11, which have been there with most of the major events. And that's another predictable facet of a hoax. It's another hoax indicator. But I consistently pointed out that this is the work of government, of man. And I've identified its purpose. Every psychological operation becomes a historic event in our consensus version of history. If you're familiar with the work of John LeBon, and I mentioned it here in the tweet, that you're not unfamiliar with the idea of history being fake, because he's done a lot of work on that, on the history hoax. So I added here, but you seem to be missing that we have evidence of history faking happening every single day in the form of news fake. I mean, there are many people who are into Tartaria, which is this conspiracy about history being fake. And they have their heads buried in the mud flood, the hypothetical mud flood of 200 years ago. But I'm saying every single day is another page in our history book. And every few pages, they give us a psyop. So I'm not saying everything is fake, but it's the fake events that drive the news cycle that everything bounces off of. A fake event is responded to by all of the editorials, and everything just assumes it to be real. It becomes hyperstition, to use a term by Baudrillard. This is hyper reality, where they have fused real and fake, and you can't tell the difference. So every day of fake news is, in fact, a page in the history book. And if you think about the cumulative effect going back decades, you can understand why I say that the world stage is a worldview that has diverged from objective reality. Now, moving on, he said, how about your nukes in 2025 prediction? If that doesn't happen, is this evidence your theory is flawed, or do you only count the predictions that seem to come true? Insinuating Texas sharpshooter fallacy, which is where you have so many data points to draw from that you can just throw everything at the wall, or shoot all your rounds at the side of the barn, and then you draw your target after the fact around the closely grouped clusters of bullets. So you look like a sharpshooter, but you're only calling your shots that hit. And this is why I think that predictive programming is a misnomer. You've got to include the real-time concurrent stuff, because we're not cherry picking from a wide array. We're looking at what's on the news today, what's in the minds of the media consumers, Netflix or Hulu that day, which dramatically reduces the number of possibilities that we could draw from. I mean, we're not saying all past movies and books and CDs, all recorded content can be retrofitted into this. No, we're saying what's in the, I'm not saying collective consciousness like it's a real thing, but what's in our consensus worldview that day, what's painting the zeitgeist. So my answer to this is this Texas sharpshooter fallacy is simply that I should first add that life does not follow Netflix, but psychological operations do. And the pattern here, the propaganda technique that we're observing offers insights and a great deal of predictability as to where things are going. So he's referring to, did I predict that there would be a nuke in 2025? That's not really what I'm doing, but here's how I explain it. Because there is predictability inherent in the model. I mean, you look at any of these events, and we talk about these things all the time on our live stream, but you look at any significant historic event, and if it's preceded by a whole lot of content that seem to eerily foreshadow it, well, then it's reasonable to say that this is an ongoing process. So it means that whatever is on right now has some significance for what's to come, if not what's happening that day. And this pattern bears out. For example, watching Joker in 2019, I mentioned that this would precede class warfare riots with masked Antifa types based on the clown mask, the followers of Joker, the Joker story. He's the underdog. He's in the subway, representative of the lower class. Society's made him a clown. The rich guys are beating him up, and he shoots them. He becomes this class warrior anti-hero. And at the time, I was observing Joaquin Phoenix's activism around environmentalism and veganism. And he even got arrested with Jane Fonda. And I looked at this holistically, suggesting what was to come. And what did we get? Well, 2020, you got riots, masked rioters, and it certainly fit within the description of class warfare. It came from the direction of woke left, which is built upon the presupposition of oppression by systemic racism, and George Floyd being the martyr in this. But the rioters were like Joker's army, Joker's masked army hid in the streets. So I went to go see Sinners, top grossing horror film of the year. I went to the theater, and I told my listeners, I said, I'm going to go watch Sinners and see what's on the menu for the next PSYOP, the next few PSYOPs, the next PSYOP season, what's coming up. So in that movie, a twin gets stabbed and dies bleeding in the arms of his brother. And the movie had a subtext of racism. The vampires were all Klansmen. This is at the time that Austin Metcalf died bleeding in the arms of his twin. And he was killed by Carmelo Anthony, who was black. And so this entire thing was racialized, capitalized on by a former January 6th prisoner. Again, January 6th. Any of these individuals involved with these big events are questionable. But he attempted to turn Austin Metcalf into a white Trayvon Martin. They wanted their own BLM, like a White Lives Matter. That event was interpreted through a racial lens and was juxtaposed against racial psyops all summer. So at that time, I noticed how the far right was obviously trying to create a George Floyd-like martyr with their own BLM. And it's interesting how they have a martyr now in Charlie Kirk. And again, Charlie Kirk, George Floyd, same birthday. Not a coincidence. And I pointed out that Charlie Kirk was going to be their George Floyd. I pointed this out on 9/11. And a lot of people didn't understand where I was coming from. And I just broke it down with the right extremes and their respective oppression narrative. One side's oppressed by systemic racism. The other side is oppressed by Israel. These are the sides, woke left, woke right. Well, who killed George Floyd? The oppressor. Systemic racism, according to the far left. Who killed Charlie Kirk? According to the woke right, like Candace Owens, the conspiracy theorists. See, red pill is a subset of woke right. So who do the red pillars think killed Charlie Kirk? Israel. So my point being, the sides have their respective world views validated. Hey, we've been vindicated. We are oppressed. Look, Derek Chauvin's oppressing that guy. And now we have to fight this system. And now the other side's like, look, Charlie Kirk got taken out because he was going against the true power structure that oppresses us. So I think it's highly significant they have the same birthdays. But again, leading up to Charlie Kirk's assassination day, they had the stabbing of the girl on the subway. That event we were looking at very closely. That event was used to catalyze a White Lives Matter. And it was called a George Floyd moment by Steven Crowder. Charlie Kirk was a part of this. They were trying to turn this girl into their George Floyd. This was all these social media influencers were doing this. Alex Jones, Matt Hyde was like, "You are Charlie Kirk, and your sister is the girl on the subway." After the Charlie Kirk thing, where they basically turned the Charlie Kirk event into the catalyst for creating their own movement that's a parallel to the BLM thing. So I watched Rebel Ridge, another movie here, because I'm going through various movies like Sinners that set the stage for incoming psyops, and I'm saying that, yeah, we're living in the wake of these things, and the stabbing of the twin is just one aspect to it. There were other events that followed that reiterated the same theme. But for example, I watched Rebel Ridge because it was #1 on Netflix. Opening scene, police brutality, racist police. A few days later, Miami Dolphins, Tyreek Hill, he's treated roughly by the police in what was considered a racially motivated arrest. And many noticed the comparison. Like, oh, this is just like Rebel Ridge. So I'm just pointing out that psychological operations follow Netflix. Life does not follow the movies. Real life does not have these types of correlations with things in mass media, entertainment, highly promoted stuff of the day, along with ready to go political agendas. So again, to get back to, if there's not a nuke in 2025, am I discredited? So here's how we arrived at this. I'm looking at Christopher Nolan and Jonathan Nolan and their movies, including Oppenheimer and Fallout. And we observe what appears to be a mass education on the phenomenon of fallout and nuclear warfare, not unlike the programming leading up to COVID-19. COVID-19 should not have been a surprise considering what led up to it within the realm of entertainment, predictive content, even stuff leading up to 2020 that you consider concurrent, like this 5-part documentary called Epidemic or Pandemic. I mean, you should have been able to have predicted it. I mean, that was 2020, hindsight's 2020. But now we're looking at this model, this pattern, this architecture of media as having some predictive capability. Since then, it seems that nukes, blackouts, EMPs have replaced the virus in terms of dominant themes. Entertainment is educating the public about these incoming events so they can respond like good NPCs. So here's where and I'm not calling it a prediction. I'm just inferring, trying to think like a metascriptor. Dark Knight Rises 2012 has a scene where a character doesn't want to wear a mask. And Batman says, you have to wear a mask to protect the people that you love. It's not for you. Well, this foreshadows 2020. That's a quote from Fauci 2020, back in 2012, coming from Batman. And then you think about the bat symbol, the burning bat, the phoenix, the bat soup, the reset. It goes pretty deep if you go in the symbolic elements and the subtext. But this character says, I don't want to wear a mask. I'm not afraid. Batman says, it's not to protect you. It's to protect the people you love. And he gives them a spherical spiked smoke grenade, which looks like a COVID ball. And he says, count to 5 and throw it. And he does. And it blows up like this mushroom cloud. So I just said, this scene foreshadows 2020, COVID-19. And interestingly, the same director, 12 years later, did Oppenheimer. So the mushroom cloud looking smoke grenade detonation, that mushroom cloud screenshot, I took that aside and I said, look, this guy later did Oppenheimer. What a coincidence. So if you follow the logic here, and this is my own personal extrapolation, that when Batman said count down from 5, he throws the spike ball, then you have the mushroom cloud. I said, this could suggest 2020, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2025, mushroom cloud. The logic here, which I'd say is sound logic, is that if content predicts future fake events, then you should be able to look at the contemporaneous content as an indicator of what's to come. And I go to movies with this in mind. So I'm not in the process of creating prophecies. I'm not trying to do that. What I'm doing is I'm engaging in media analysis that accounts for history bending psychological operations. I mean, news bending, manipulating news, warping the worldview, accumulated over time, has maligned our entire history. We live on a fabricated historic timeline. I mean, a lot of it's real, sure. You're real, I'm real, but what's going in the history books largely is infused with fakery. This is not speculation by conspiracy theorists. This is actually what media does. Well, you can't really debunk it without explaining away 60 plus years of concurrent programming aligning with fake events. The burden of proof has shifted to the mainstream perspective to defend itself. So there's the mainstream perspective, it's mere coincidence, and there's the alternative perspective, it's done by something other than man that we can't explain, whether it's the simulation or dark occultists. But the burden of proof has shifted to them to explain away 60 plus years of this relationship between entertainment and fake events. So I'm consistently demonstrating that psyops happen in a media ecosystem in which fiction and reality are blended. This is less of a theory and more of an understanding of how entertainment is a part of government. At this point, it borders on reality denialism to act like predictive programming is not a factor in the psychological operations. What seals it is the consistent concurrent stuff. That's far more difficult to dismiss. And it's far simpler to diagnose as having a very specific political utility. Synchronicities and coincidences are not going to have political agendas. Now, continuing, it would not count against my quote theory that nukes are going to happen in the next 2.5 months. But he says, you have studied this and you're the leader in the field. You predicted there'd be nukes in 2025. What happens if there's no nukes? Does this count against your theory? So again, I just had to reiterate here that our predictions are based on the fact that it has been predictable thus far. If you had this foreknowledge, every single major fake event that we've analyzed even bears this out. If we had foreknowledge about this, we could have been making predictions all along if we wanted to, but that's not what I'm doing here. So John Levon had said, let's find some non-fake stories to test your claim that pop culture coincidences only precede fake events. So for example, if the Charlie Kirk thing was real, then these examples in The Tempest, in Heads of State, in Snake Eyes, in Emerson Drive, if that was real, those would be a lot more eerie, if you think about it. I mean, between the Emerson Drive thing, the Charlie Kirk appearance on Thought Crimes, where they talked about the last execution was on September 10th, the last televised execution. If that was real, yeah, these things would be very eerie. But what he asked me here is, if there's a non-fake story that's also preceded by pop culture coincidences, is your theory debunked? Well, that's an interesting proposition there. And I would say, first of all, that he's asking, like, have you found one non-fake story, or do you believe everything is fake? And this comes down to burden of proof, because we're analyzing the events that are given national attention, that are put on blast, that have so many hallmarks of fakery. So I just sort of retorted with, can you give me a list of the mass reported school shootings that you think are real? Like the last one, the Annunciation school shooting, where the trans neo-Nazi satanic shooter shoots up a Christian school. Okay, there's one. Do you think that's real? Well, that one we hyperanalyzed, and it was preceded by a movie called Weapons. And it not only does that movie have many elements that were featured in that shooting, but both of these relate to the Charlie Kirk event. So what I'm pointing out here is that I would need a list of school shootings or terror attacks that you think are real, and we can go from there, because the burden of proof is not on me anymore. I don't think the media's primary preoccupation is informing us about the world, but rather conforming us to a pre-existing model. We can consistently observe systemic fakery, fake events, psyops influencing the news cycle. No thinking person would say all news is fake. No thinking person would say all news is real, at face value. It's a matter of skepticism, when you pause and you wait and you get more facts. It's not about incredulity. It's not like I just don't want to believe it. It's about skepticism. I want to know the truth. And the skeptic has to be informed. They can't just be dismissive. So it's the fake events. I'm not saying all things are fake, but it is the fake ones that augment our otherwise reality-tested version of history. Furthermore, media is a good liar. It does not lie with every breath, but it lies strategically to those who trust it in order to manipulate them. The burden of proof is not on the skeptics, given the preponderance of evidence suggesting systemic fakery. It's part of the media architecture. So I would ask you to provide a list of school shootings with high death tolls or terror attacks with high death tolls that you believe to be real. We're past the point where you can hand wave away concurrent programming, as it is direct evidence of agenda-driven propaganda placement in mass entertainment corresponding to fake events, which are grafted onto the consensus history via the mechanism of fake news accumulation. A small percentage of the stories are fake. The identifiable psychological operations as revealed by hoax indicators and hallmarks of fakery are what we are talking about here. So I'm the last person to say everything's fake. I look at all the news. I'm a news junkie. I'm very well aware of what's going on in the world. And what I'm doing here is discerning real from fake. I've never said everything is fake. I've always made my criteria very clear. That's a straw man argument, and it does not address the evidence itself. So I ask him, are you denying that predictive programming exists? Are you in denial about synchronized propaganda, entertainment coinciding with staged events? Because this is real. We're observing it. This Charlie Kirk thing highlights it in a lot of ways that has made it very useful for this discussion. So now to continue. Now, when I say media is a good liar, good liars are strategic. They don't lie with every breath. Now, another aspect to this conversation has been, who's behind it? And I have answered that question. We've noticed the directors, the artists, the musicians, those who are in some way involved in the PSYOP entertainment complex. And the purpose of it, I'm saying, is history bending. And these are not real difficult propositions to understand. History bending is lie control, mind control. It's like religious mind control, but high tech. The next iteration of cult mind control, but this is encompassing billions. And there are criteria. We're talking about national news stories that have immediately implementable agendas that you would not have push through were it not for this particular event. You can just look at the Charlie Kirk thing to see how many events were pushed in the wake of it to get an idea. So this overall analysis that we have that is inclusive of the entertainment sphere provides indications that this event necessarily would have been planned long in advance. And these are engineered historic events. They're not tragedies. It was a magic trick more than a snuff film. All right, now let's continue. What I'm doing is I'm going through my Twitter back and forth exchange with John LeBon and just trying to get all of his questions answered to the best of my ability. He's challenging these various propositions, starting with, can we predict this stuff? And I have been predicting predictive programming, which sounds ridiculous, but it's exactly what you can do. If the movie's number one, if it's top on Netflix, it's likely going to contain relevant content to reinforce incoming agendas and psyops. And these are not only things where people die, where there's destruction. There are many different forms of psyops that oftentimes don't involve any kind of violence or tragedy at all. Sometimes it's scandals like Wag the Dog. The movie Wag the Dog, interestingly enough, and let me bring this up because we do have a Wag the Dog media. Black comedy, 1997, a satire with Robert De Niro and Dustin Hoffman. Now, Wag the Dog was released a month before the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal and the bombing of the pharmaceutical factory in Sudan by the Clinton administration. This prompted the media to draw a comparison between the film and reality. So the media sometimes notices this stuff. The comparison was made in 98 when the administration initiated a bombing campaign of Iraq during the impeachment trial for the Clinton-Lewinsky thing. They made the comparison again in the spring, 99, when the administration intervened in Kosovo and bombed Yugoslavia, which coincidentally bordered Albania and contained ethnic Albanians. Now, here's what the movie's about. Wag the Dog. The president is caught making advances on an underage girl in the Oval Office 2 weeks before his election. So they bring in a spin doctor, and he says, let's construct a fictional war in Albania and get the media to concentrate on it instead. They contact a Hollywood producer to create the war, complete with a theme song and fake footage of a fleeing orphan to arouse sympathy. The hoax is initially successful, and the president gains in the polls. Goes on, they create a hero who's left behind in Albania. So now what we're seeing here is an example of a movie predicting with specificity something that happens in real life, and the movie, ironically, is about the media being used to manipulate public perception away from a scandal which happens with Clinton. So Wag the Dog, satire, comedy, but pretty accurate. So I think I've covered most of the relevant questions and comments that he had raised here. And I know that there's a lot more that this conversation could go into, but I think the main points that I wanted to emphasize have been raised here. I just want to make sure that we understand where each other are coming from. It's not about changing anybody's mind, but it's about getting the best facts out there. And he did ask me, how are you not a part of it? You're creating content, you're talking about this. And I am emphasizing that for it to be considered programming, synchronized with fake events, this predictive programming thing, it has to be reaching a mass audience. And I'm not a part of that history-making click. I'm not one of the meta scripters. I'm not a Kubrick, not James Cameron, Jordan Peele, Christopher Nolan, Jonathan Nolan. And another thing, this also obliterates the idea that this is caused by something higher than man. The same directors consistently create predictive programming content in different movies for different events. So how do you explain that? By deferring to a higher power. You can't. There is no argument there. So we concluded this. I had explained to him my criteria for determining whether or not something can be considered relevant programming. And he said, that's a fair answer. I appreciate the time you've taken to share your thoughts in this Twitter exchange. My own skepticism of the predictive programming paradigm is driven largely by how far I know coincidences can go in this realm, in real life and online. I'm open-minded, though. I think Ian Fleming said, 007, James Bond, he said, once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, 3 times is enemy action. And this went from this anomalous occurrence where it was actually kind of spooky. It's like, whoa, that movie foreshadowed that. And it did have this kind of spooky element of, is this supernatural? Is this matrixy? Where are we? And over time, I've demystified it because it became so predictable. It became so routine that when I see these connections, I'm like not mind blown. My head's not exploding. I'm not confused. I'm actually saying, okay, well, that's what I expected. But my response to that was, thanks for taking the time to think critically and in depth. I'm compiling this discussion as a single article to be read as a podcast. So it started off with my claim that sounds pretty bold, that we can predict the occurrence of predictive programming that will be relevant. And I did it with Charlie Kirk. We do it routinely. But as far as predicting a new 2025 based upon a couple of clips from the Jonathan Nolan and Christopher Nolan thing, in context, I think my logic is sound. Am I saying that there's going to be a fake nuke deployed in the next few months? It wouldn't shock me. It wouldn't shock me. But my entire take on this isn't about making these predictions like this is some kind of a game, or we're going to take bets or something. I'm not trying to be, I'm not a doomsayer. I'm not saying they're going to nuke us. You better buy my MREs. I'm not saying the world's going to end. No, I'm suggesting here that government and media are so intertwined at this point that they're virtually one and the same. That entertainment, news media, government, religion, they're all part of this monolithic presence that creates the consensus worldview, which gives total control over time, chronology, over worldview to over billions of people. That is tantamount to a new religion. And I am not overstating my case here as evidenced by 2020. That demonstrates the global reach of it. And that was an event that had every single mark of fakery, including all of the content in the entertainment that foreshadowed it, predicted it, the way it was rolled out. Nothing about it was organic, but everything about it fit this pattern of, this is a historic event that's been totally engineered, planned long in advance. So there's really no denying that there is a monolithic presence with global reach and total control, incontestable power. And here we are unpacking the architecture, the hidden architecture that explains how you can have parallel content inserted into various areas that are usually considered to be separate. It shouldn't be. The media calls it eerie, and I'm saying no, it is actually not eerie whatsoever once you recognize that this is what media is, and it's part of its overarching purpose, which is not about informing you. They're not trying to give you the best information for your edification, but it's about conforming you to a prefabricated worldview. And we've been living through it. This is Bread and Circuses 2025. We'll say thanks for listening. Thanks, John LeBon, for the thought responses and questions. And I look forward to reading everyone's comments and responding to those as this conversation continues to evolve. And I think this was a very productive back and forth exchange today, and that's why I wanted to get this recorded. I just think that that thread is too good to be lost. So have a great evening, and click the links below. Sign up for the newsletter and stay in the know. This is the IPS deprogram for 10/14. It's 2:20 a.m. So we'll be talking again in about 12 hours or so, and we'll see what's happening between the Charlie Kirk and George Floyd birthday parties.